Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Daily Morning News, bringing you the latest news around the globe. Today is Tuesday, June 6, 2022. I'm Benjamin, and this is a special breaking news edition of our macroeconomic report. We interrupt our regular programming to bring you the latest developments that are set to impact the global economy. So, fasten your seatbelts because we're diving right into the heart of the action. Let's move on to the first session of our news report.
Good evening, I'm Lin Jiazheng, one of the news presenters who will accompany you for the next session. Today, I will keep you updated with the crucial macroeconomic phenomenon related with the COVID-19 pandemic. COVID-19 pandemic seriously impacted the world economy between 2019 and 2022. Many countries were locked down for months because of virus outbreak. First, I'm going to explain how could the lockdown in a country influence the aggregate demand in that country. The lockdown leads to a contraction in aggregate demand due to the decrease in consumption spending, and consumption is one of the components of GDP that contribute to the aggregate demand for goods and services. As the below equation shows, the four components, consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports, contribute to the aggregate demand for goods and services. Now, I would like to analyze the impact of the lockdown on a country's economy in the short run and in the long run by this model. Curve 81 and curve SRAS1 are initial aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. So point A is the initial equilibrium. Then a contraction in aggregate demand caused by the lockdown shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left from 81 to 82. Now, point B becomes the new equilibrium. Output falls below the natural rate of output from Y1 to Y2, and overprice falls from P1 to P2 in the short run. However, over the time, the lower quantity of output makes wages lower, that production cost reducing, which makes firms supply more. Therefore, the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right from SRAS1 to SRAS2. Then, point C becomes the equilibrium. Output returns to its natural rate from Y2 to Y1, and overprice further falls from P2 to P3 in the long run. In response to the short-run economic fluctuations caused by the lockdown, the government can increase the aggregate demand by two ways. One is increasing government purchase, so the component of real GDP, G, will contribute to the aggregate demand for goods and services. And the other way is lowering tax rates. By doing so, people have more disposable income, so they are willing to consume more. The component of real GDP, C, therefore contributes to the aggregate demand for goods and services. In response to the short-run economic fluctuations caused by the lockdown, the central bank of country can also increase the money supply by three ways. Conducting open market operations, such as buying short-term bonds from the public. When the central bank buys government bonds, the money supply increases. Also, the central bank can influence the money supply with the reserving requirements. Decreasing the reserve requirements can increase the money supply. In addition, decreasing the discount rate can increase the money supply as well. As models show, increase in money supply falling interest rates from R1 to R2, and the lower interest rate stimulated investment, which increases the quantity of goods and services demanded. So, aggregate demand curve shifts to the right from 81 to 82. Now, I would like to introduce a fiscal policy about Taiwanese government issue printable stimulus vouchers to all citizens as well as permanent residents in 2021 in response to the short-run macroeconomics impact of COVID-19 pandemic. The printable stimulus vouchers policies in Taiwan is a form of fiscal stimulus that the government issues vouchers so that the public can spend. This policy aims to boost domestic consumption and support business affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. By increasing consumer spending, the policy can stimulate economic growth, create jobs, and increase government revenue, which achieves the effect of revitalizing the economy. Since the money is paid by the government's financial budget, it belongs to the fiscal policy. You may wonder how these policies solve the macroeconomics problems caused by the COVID-19 pandemic in Taiwan. Let me analyze for you. The government protects extra income to public so people would like to consume more. Besides, government expenditure has a multiplier effect on aggregate demand. The multiplier effect refers to the additional shifts in aggregate demand when expansionary fiscal policy increase income and thereby increase consumer spending. In other words, each dollar spent by the government can raise the aggregate demand for goods and services by more than $1. This increases consumption, which is one of the components that contribute to aggregate demand. Hence, this policy can offset the contractions in aggregate demand caused by COVID-19 pandemic. As an example shows on this graph, an increase in government purchase of $30 billion initially increased aggregate demand by $30 billion from curve 81 to 82. But the multiplier effect can amplify the shift in aggregate demand by more than $30 billion. So, the eddy curve has addition shifts from 82 to 83. Thus, what we can infer from this macroeconomics phenomenon is that COVID-19 pandemic leads to a reduction in aggregate demand, and the central bank and government can conduct some policies to increase aggregate demand to solve problems. That's all the news for this session. However, this is not the end for today's news. Stay with us for the next sessions with more thought-provoking macroeconomics issues.
Hi, I'm Jenny, the news reporter for this section. First, let's take a look at the news. Recently, a complete import ban on Russian seaborne crude oil and petroleum products has sent energy prices to a historic high. First, I'm going to use a graph to explain why this sanction caused the energy price to rise sharply. So globally, the supply of crude oil decreases due to the ban, which shifts the supply curve to the left, causing the energy price to soar. Next, how could this sanction affect overall price in the European Union and the short-run output and unemployment? So as you can see, due to the rise in energy price, the cost of production increases, so the short-run aggregated supply curve shifts to the left. As you can see in the graph, it caused inflation to rise, and the output will decreases. Because firms don't produce that much, they will hire fewer employees, which cause unemployment to rise. If EU authority would like to solve this inflation problem, what kind of fiscal policy is appropriate for the EU authority to implement? So they will increase government spending, which lower the supply for vulnerable funds, which cause interest rate to go up, so that the investment will decrease. When the investment decreases, it will shift aggregated demand curve to the left, as you can see in the graph, so that the inflation will become lower. However, the output will further decreases, which will cause the unemployment problem to become more severe. Let's imagine another situation. If the EU authority would like to solve the recession problem, what kind of monetary policy is appropriate for the EU authority to implement? So the EU authority will increase money supply, which will lower the interest rate. When the interest rate is lower, the investment will increase. When the investment increases, it will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. And then the output will rise to the original level. However, the inflation problem will get worse. In conclusion, EU can only use a single policy to simultaneously solve both inflation and recession problem. As you can see in these two graphs, if you want to lower the inflation, you will decrease the output, and that the unemployment problem become more severe. And if you want to solve the recession problem, the output will rise to the original level. However, the inflation will increase. So this is the end of this section. If you want to learn more about some economic global news, you can go to the next session.
Good evening, I'm Melody, one of the news presenters who will accompany you for the next session. Now, I will keep you looking through a crucial macroeconomic phenomenon, the impact after the trade wars and technology decoupling between America and China. However, before analyzing, let's review the whole event first. Over the year, America has had a huge trade deficit with China. China's exports to America are hundreds of billions of dollars more than America exports to China every year, and the deficit continues to expand every year. Since President Trump took office, he has been extremely dissatisfied with the huge trade deficit between China and America. He accuses China of gaining lots of benefits from Western economies since joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, but not fulfilling its commitment, such as fully opening Chinese market and pursuing a free economy. As a result, America launched a trade war imposing punitive tariffs on goods made in China. Because of the tariff, the cost of selling goods to America is higher than before. This makes a decrease in Chinese exports, causing the net exports fall. And in technology decoupling, America has reached a consensus with big companies like TSMC. Therefore, China will not get the key technologies and products such as chips, manufacturing equipment, and artificial intelligence. This decision will make China progress in technology slower and cannot get the improvement technology and human resources. Investing in China has become less attractive than before. More and more people get back their capital. Therefore, there is a decrease in the purchase of domestic assets by foreigners, and the net capital increase. And now, let's analyze the impact on China's real interest rate and real exchange rate. As we know previously, the trade war made a decrease in Chinese net exports. Therefore, the demand in the exchange of foreign currency shift left. However, this event doesn't have an impact on the net capital outflow, so the supply remains the same. As a result, the real interest rate is unchanged, and the real exchange rate decreases. Then, let's go on to another event. Technological decoupling. Net capital outflow increases. Therefore, net capital outflow shift right. This makes the supply in the exchange of foreign currency shift right, and the demand in the market of loanable funds shift right. However, this event doesn't have an impact on the net export. As a result, the real interest rate increases and the real exchange rate decreases. Now, we combine these two situations together. The trade war had no change in real interest rate and a decrease in the real exchange rate. Technological decoupling had an increase in real interest rate and a decrease in the real exchange rate. Therefore, we can get the final result, an increase in the real interest rate and an even more decrease in the real exchange rate. Thanks for your watching. Let's go on to the next presenter.
Good evening. I'm Cynthia Kusuma, one of the news presenters who will accompany you with the next session. Today, I will keep you updated with a crucial macroeconomic phenomenon related with quantitative easing policy. So here is the background for our topic today. In the past decade, the quantitative easing policy was often used by major economies such as the USA, Japan, and the EU to deal with its recession problem. These economies could no longer use conventional monetary policy, for example, buying the short-term government bond to increase the money supply, to lower the short-term interest rate due to the liquidity trap in the money market. Therefore, they choose to use the quantitative easing policy, for example, buying longer-term government-backed securities to increase the money supply, to lower the long-term interest rate, and the main goal was to stimulate the economy by increasing aggregate demand. So first of all, I would like to introduce to you about the monetary policy. Monetary policy is a set of instruments available to a central bank to control the money supply level. There are four main tools for monetary policy. The first one is reserve requirement, the second, open market operation, followed by discount rate, and the last is interest on reserves. So in reserve requirement is the amount of percentage of a bank's total reserves that banks must hold against deposits and may not be loaned. The higher the reserve requirement, the lower the money supply. The higher the reserve requirement will increase the money supply. The second one is open market operations. Open market operations is the actions taken by the Fed to buy and sell government bonds to the public. If the Fed buy government bonds, then there will be increase in the money supply. But if the Fed sell the government bonds, there will be a decrease in the money supply. The third one is discount rate. Discount rate is the interest rate that the Fed charges banks for loans. The higher the discount rate will decrease the money supply. The lower the discount rate will increase the money supply. Because a high discount rate will discourage banks to make loans from the Fed. And the lower the discount rate will encourage the bank to make more loans from the Fed, which will increase the money supply. The last one is interest on reserves. In the past, the Fed will not pay any interest on deposits held by the bank as a reserve, but now the Fed would pay the bank interest on those deposits, meaning that if the higher in the interest rate on reserves, bank would like to increase the deposit more. They are going to hold more cash for reserves, meaning that there will be a decrease in the money supply. And as reverse, if the interest rate on reserves is very low, then there will be an increase in the money supply. Let's talk about money supply and money demand. Money supply is controlled by the Fed, meaning that the quantity of the money supplied will not depend on any interest rate. However, money demand, according to the theory of liquidity preference, one of the most important determinant is the interest rate. Therefore, an increase in the interest rate will raise the opportunity cost of holding money. The opportunity cost of holding money is the interest that could be earned if the money was put on interest earning assets instead of holding it as a cash. Therefore, if the interest rate is higher, meaning that holding cash will give you more opportunity cost in terms of the interest that you could earn through investment in the interest earning assets. Therefore, the money demand and the money supply will meet together in a point which is the equilibrium interest rate. When the interest rate is very high, for example, R1, then there will be excess of money supply compared to the money demand. As a result, the interest rate will adjust to be lower and reach until the equilibrium point. If in case the interest rate is lower than the equilibrium, then there will be a shortage of money. As a result, the interest rate will be higher until it reaches the equilibrium point. Let us talk about money market and aggregate demand. So, an increase in the price level will make an increase in the demand for the money because now price is higher. It means that we need to hold more money in order to buy something, which causes the equilibrium interest rate to increase. Because the money supply is fixed, it means that the curve is going to be a vertical line. And as a result, the shift in the money demand is going to make an increase in the equilibrium interest rate, which now in turn will reduce the quantity of goods and services demanded. It is because an increase in the equilibrium interest rate will cause a decrease in spending on investment goods. Now let us talk about Fed's monetary injection. So monetary injection is an action taken by the Fed to inject money into the economy of country, which by this it means that the Fed is going to increase the money supply in the money market, which will shift the money supply to the right. This will cause the equilibrium interest rate to fall. And as a result, this will shift the aggregate demand curve, or it means that there will be an increase in the quantity of goods and services demanded at any given price level. This is due to the fact that the interest rate is now lower. It means that it's going to push the investment, and the quantity of goods and services demanded is going to be higher. Now let's talk about the forms of monetary policy. Some monetary policy can be described either in the terms of money supply or in the terms of interest rate. So changes in the monetary policy can be viewed either in terms of changing the interest rate target or in terms of changing the money supply. So changes in the monetary policy aimed at expanding aggregate demand can be described as either increasing the money supply, as what we have said before, or lowering the interest rate. Because lowering interest rate is going to push the investment, which will expand the aggregate demand more. And changes in the monetary policy aimed at contracting aggregate demand is going to be described either as decreasing the money supply or raising the interest rate, because raising the interest rate is going to discourage the investment, which will contract the aggregate demand. Now let us talk about the difference between conventional and quantitative easing policy. So normally the Fed conducts expansionary open market operations by buying the short-term government bonds, as we have discussed before. This is the type of conventional monetary policy. But on the other hand, it could also buy mortgage backed securities and long-term government bonds to lower the interest rates on this kind of long-term loans. This will create demands for these securities and then increasing the price, because the demand is now higher, so it will increase the price of it, and in return it's going to decrease the yield, because price and yield goes in different ways, and the demand for the securities is going to inject more money into the banking system. This will put downward pressure on the interest rate, and now it will increase spending and investment because of the lower interest rate. And this will expand the aggregate demand and boost the economy. This is what we call as quantitative easing policy. So instead of buying the short-term government bonds, the Fed is going to buy mortgage-backed securities and longer-term government bonds to lower long-term interest rate instead of the short-term temporary interest rate. What is quantitative easing policy? Quantitative easing, or known as QE, is a type of unconventional monetary policy used by the monetary authorities in which a nation's central bank, such as the Federal Reserve, or also known as the Fed, attempts to increase the liquidity in its financial system and further stimulate the economy by purchasing a large number of long-term securities in the open market in order to increase the money supply, which will in turn lower the long-term interest rates, and this will encourage lending and investment. So, instead of buying short-term government bonds, financial assets that will be purchased by the Fed is long-term Treasury bonds, U.S. Treasury securities, agency MBS or mortgage-backed securities, and the federal agency securities. So QE strategy is often used by the Fed and the government as an alternative way during a crisis when an open market operations had failed. For example, the interest rate may be already at zero, but there is still a slowdown in the lending and economic activity. And globally, the central banks have attempted to deploy the quantitative easing as a means of preventing recession and deflation in the countries. So let us talk about QE policy in the USA. So the background behind the QE policy in the USA is the Great Recession of 2008 until 2009. So, because of the low interest rates and more securitizations allowed a boom in the housing market. But the high price of the housing is unstable. Therefore, there was a surge in mortgage defaults and foreclosures of home. This is due to the fact that the housing price started to fall, and this will cause the borrower's debt value to be higher compared to the value of their house, and because of it, the borrowers stop paying debt. And this causes default losses for the banks and the financial institutions. And there is also an increase in the supply of houses for sale. Because of the lower price, people will try to just sell their houses, and this put more pressure on its price. And this is the cause of the residential investment collapse. And also because of the default losses, many FIs didn't have enough funds to loan out. Even creditworthy customers found themselves unable to borrow and finance investment spending from the financial institutions. This is what we call as a credit crunch. Both of these conditions, residential investment collapse and credit crunch, causes a contractionary shift in the aggregate demand. And as a result, real GDP and employment fell sharp. Unemployment rises. So, to solve this kind of problem, the Fed used two ways to make the economy more liquid. The first one is the Fed cut its target for the federal funds rate from 5.25% in September 2007 and to about from 0% to 0.25% in December 2008. And this stayed for at least 7 years. And also the QE policy, which means that the Fed started buying mortgage-backed securities and other long-term debt in over market operations. The goals were to lower the long-term interest rate and to provide financial system with additional funds so that banks can make more loans more readily and available. And since this financial crisis in 2009, the Fed has initiated 3 more QEs in 2010, 2012, and in March 2020, in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So for the QE1 from December 2008 to March 2010, the Fed purchases around $175 billion in agency debt from Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Ginnie Mae, and also in MBS mortgage-backed securities around $1.25 trillion and $300 billion in long-term treasury debt. For the QE2 from November 2010 to June 2011, it purchases $600 billion of long-term treasuries at $75 billion per month. And for the QE3 from September 2012 to December 2013, it was divided into two steps. The first step is in September 2012. It purchases 40 billion US dollar agency mortgage-based security per month, and for December, it keeps purchasing the same 40 billion US dollar worth agency mortgage-based securities per month, but added 45 billion worth US dollar, 45 billion US dollars worth of long-term treasury securities. And QE4, or also known as the coronavirus bond buying program, it mainly purchases around 80 billion US dollar of agency debt and 40 billion US dollars of mortgage-based securities. By July 2020, it had purchased 3 trillion in financial assets, increasing its balances from 4.2 trillion US dollars in February to 7 trillion. And since August 2020, it was committed to a monthly bond buying program. By July 2021, its balance sheet stood at 7.3 trillion US dollar. Now let us talk about the QE policy in Japan. So the background is the Japanese CPI in October 2013 was roughly the same as in October 1993. This means that the Japanese CPI had ups and downs over the past 20 years, but the average inflation has been roughly zero. This uncommonly low inflation rate is viewed as harmful to economic performance. So the QE policy was actually first introduced in 2001 with the bank's Japanese expansive monetary policy response to bursting of the nation's real estate bubble and the deflationary pressures that followed. From 2001 to 2006, the Bank of Japan used the QE policy to stimulate its stagnant economy. It increases the reserves from 5 trillion yen to 35 trillion yen. So, here is the list of how QE policy has been conducted in the Japan. From March 2001 to March 2006, the Bank of Japan has increased its monetary base by roughly 60%. It increased its reserve from 5 trillion yen to 35 trillion yen. And for the QE2 from October 2010 to April 2013, there is a relatively small QE program implemented, but it gradually morphed into the recent more aggressive intervention by QE3, which started from April 2013. From this QE3, there has been an increase in monetary base at annual pace of about 60 to 70 trillion yen, and increase of the outstanding amounts of ETFs and JREITs. ETFs, also known as exchange traded funds, and JREITs is the Japan Real Estate Investment Trust at an annual pace of 1 trillion yen and 30 billion yen. The annual pace of the monetary base growth was increased to 80 trillion on October 31, 2014. The annual targeted amount of ETF purchase was increased to 3.2 trillion yen on March 15, 2016. And as we can see from here, this is the Japanese monetary base and price level CPI. You can see that there has been 3 QEs conducted, and actually there is relatively small changes in the CPI, especially in the QE1. However, it shows progression in QE3 due to the more aggressive QE program conducted by the Bank of Japan. Now let's talk about the liquidity trap. So according to the theory of liquidity preference, as the money of supply is controlled by the Fed, expansionary monetary policy can be done by reducing interest rate and stimulating investment spending. When the money supply increases, the equilibrium interest rate falls and the quantity demanded for money increases. But what if the interest rate have already fallen to around zero? The answer is the monetary policy may no longer be effective. This is due to the fact that nominal interest rate cannot fall much below zero. Rather than making a loan at a negative nominal interest rate, a person would just hold cash. It means that the opportunity cost of holding money is very small and is very low. Therefore, people will just hold money instead of making loan. So, in this environment, a stationary monetary policy is the supply of money, making the public's asset portfolio more liquid. But because interest rate cannot fall any further, the extra liquidity might not have any effect anymore. Thus, the aggregate demand, production, employment trapped at lower level. So, liquidity trap is what the conventional monetary policy faced. So normal monetary policy can no longer lower interest rate when the short-term interest rates are either at or already close to the zero, which means that the interest rate is very low. And increasing the money supply will not lower the interest rate any further because the money demand is already perfectly elastic or horizontal at a low interest rate, as we can see from this graph. And this is the graph for the liquidity trap. As we can see that when the money supply shift from MS1 to MS2, there is a decrease in the interest rate from 7 to 5. However, when there is a shift from money supply 3 to money supply 4, there is no any decrease in the interest rates. The interest rate remains at the low level, which is 0.5, meaning that there is a liquidity trap. It means that expanding the money supply will not making the interest rate any lower anymore. So increasing the money supply is no longer effective to lower the interest rates in this kind of environment. So there are two alternatives that can be done to solve this liquidity trap. The first one is by forward guidance. It means that to have the central bank commit itself to keeping the interest rate low for an extended period of time. So even if the central bank's target currently for interest rate cannot fall any further, but the promise that interest rate will remain at low level may help to stimulate the investment spending because the promise is that the interest rate will remain low for such a long time. And the second one is by quantitative easing policy. So by this policy, the Fed is going to increase the bank reserves unconventionally by having the central bank conduct expansionary open market operations using a larger variety of financial instruments, which means that by using longer term government bonds or MBS mortgage-backed securities to lower interest rate for a longer term one instead of the short-term interest rate. And now I'm going to talk about how the quantitative easing policy can help to solve the liquidity trap problem. So, by quantitative easing policy, the Fed is going to create credit, which means adding money to the banking system by creating bank reserves on its balance sheet. And after that, the Fed is going to buy assets of longer maturity, for example, like long-term treasury bonds or MBS mortgage-backed securities on the open market. As a result, there will be an increase for the demand of these assets. This will cause the bond price to go up because the demand of its asset is now increasing, which will push the price to go up, but it is going to make the returns of the asset goes down because the price and yield actually goes in different ways. And because the demand of this asset increases, this will make the new money enters the economy. This new money is going to provide the financial system with additional funds so that the banks can now make more loans readily available. This will free up their capital and increase their credit availability and unlocks their liquidity. Remember the ones that I mentioned previously before, that there is a credit crunch, which means that even the creditworthy customers are not able to make any loans for their investment due to the liquidity trap. Because the credit availability is now increasing, FIs are more motivated to loan more, which make it easier for any individuals or businesses to obtain loans. And as a result, the money supply is going to increase. This is going to push the interest rate down, especially the long-term interest rate, because through quantitative easing policy, the central banks actually purchase the longer term of assets. And as the interest rate go down, it is going to lower the borrowing cost and the lending fee. This is going to discourage any savings, but it's going to encourage more borrowing and for spending and investment purpose. As a result, the stock price is going to go up. Because just now we have talked about the yield of the bonds is now lower, which means that it's now a poorer investment because of the low returns. As a result, the stock price is going to go up, and this will encourage banks and other investors to look to rebalance their portfolios, which when the new investment occurs, the new liquidity is redirected towards the bonds and shares, and the stock price is going to go up, and because it's going to be seen as a higher return compared to the bonds. And as a result, there will be an increase in investment and consumption, because now people who hold the stock as their assets is going to be wealthier. This will increase the consumption, and now more business and individuals can make lending and loans. This will increase the investment. As a result, aggregate demand is going to increase. Because aggregate demand expands, this is going to stimulate the economy. As a result, the quantity of output or real GDP is going to increase, and unemployment is going to be reduced because of the increase in the real GDP. At the same time, the overall price of the economy is going to increase, which indicates that there will be an inflation. Now, let us talk about how the quantitative easing policy can actually shift the aggregate demand in different markets, except the ones that we have mentioned earlier. The first one is the mortgage market. So mortgage loans actually take the interest rate on long-term government bonds, such as the 10-year low-risk government bonds, as their benchmark. So when the long-term interest rate falls due to the quantitative easing policy, this will actually make the mortgage interest rates fall. And as a result, this is going to stimulate an increase in demand for the property market, because the interest rate fall, people now intend to buy more property because it's cheaper now. And for the currency market, an increase in the supply of money with the interest rate falling due to the policy of quantitative easing, this may lead to an increase in the net capital outflow, because the commercial banking system from the local one tends to seek for a better return to other countries. So there will be a capital outflow from the country to another country, and this may cause the exchange rate to depreciate, which means that there will be a weaker currency. And this is going to cause the export to increase and import to decrease. which leads to an increase in the net exports. It's going to have a net expansionary effect on the aggregate demand. Because as we have learned previously, the aggregate demand is made of consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. So now let's see the curve of aggregate demand, how the aggregate demand can shift to the right due to the quantitative easing policy because of four effects. The first one is wealth effect. So lower yields lead to higher share and bond prices. As a result, holders of these assets experience an increase in their wealth. They feel wealthier. As a result, they are going to consume more and spend more. This will stimulate the aggregate demand. And the second effect is called as borrowing cost effect. Quantitative easing policy lowers the interest rate on longer-term debt such as government bonds and mortgage. This is going to stimulate loans and investment. And the third one is known as the lending effect. Because quantitative easing policy increases the liquidity of the bank, it means that now banks is able to lend more to companies or households, making more loans to them. And this also increase the expectations toward the economy. Now people become more optimistic with the economy. As a result, there will be an increase in the consumer spending and investment. And the last one is currency effect. As we have learned previously, that lower interest rate can cause the exchange rate to weaken or depreciate, which causes an increase in the net export. And net export is one of the components of the aggregate demand. An increase in net export is going to also stimulate and expand the aggregate demand. As a result of these four effects, the aggregate demand is going to shift from the left to the right. Indicates that there is an increase in the aggregate demand. Because the aggregate supply doesn't change, it means that a shift in aggregate demand is going to cause the price level to increase, and the real GDP or the quantity of output is going to increase as well. And because there is an increase in the real GDP, there is going to be a reduction in the unemployment. Thus, we can infer that quantitative easing policy will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right, and the output increases, and the overall price of the economy is going to be increased. Thus, we can infer from this macroeconomic phenomenon is that when there is a recession problem and a liquidity trap where demand for money is perfectly elastic and normal monetary policy can no longer lower interest rate, as short-term interest rates are either at or close to zero, employing quantitative easing policy like buying longer-term government-backed securities to increase the money supply can lower the longer-term interest rate and can increase the aggregate demand and stimulate the economy. So that's all for the news for this session. However, this is not the end for our today's news. And stay with us for the next session with more thought-provoking macroeconomic issues.
Good evening, I'm Chen Tingan, the news presenter for this session. Now I'm going to talk about two theories that different school followers believe in: monetary neutrality and multiplier effect. So let's talk about what is monetary neutrality. It is an economic concept that suggests change in the money supply have no real effect on the overall level of economic output or employment in the long run. According to this concept, an increase or decrease in the money supply only leads to change in the general price level without affecting output, employment, or productivity. The idea behind monetary neutrality is based on several assumptions. The first one, flexible prices and wages. The theory assumes that price and wage adjust freely and quickly in response to change in the money supply. The second one, rational expectations. This assumption implies that people will adjust their behavior based on anticipated changes in the money supply. The third one, long-run perspective. Monetary neutrality applies to the long run rather than the short run. So, why classical school followers believe in monetary neutrality? That is because of several reasons. The first one, long-run equilibrium. They argue that markets tend to adjust and reach a state of equilibrium where the quantity of goods and services produced match the quantity demanded. The second one, flexible prices and wages. They believe that in the long run, any increase in the money supply will lead to a proportional increase in price, ensuring that real economic variables remain unaffected. The third one, rational expectations. They argue that individuals will adjust their behavior based on anticipated change in the money supply, thereby minimizing any real effects. Next, let's talk about what is multiplier effect. It refers to the phenomena where an initial change in spending or investment creates a large impact on the overall economy. It is based on the idea that an increase in aggregate demand leads to an increase in income, which in turn generates additional spending and further increase in income. The multiplier effect operates through a chain of spending and income generation. So let's see how it works. The first initial increase in spending, and it will increase income. So it will cause a production and employment increase, and then higher the consumer spending and continuation of the process. So let's make an example. Assume that government increased its spending by 1 million. It leads to increased demand for goods and services. As a result, business experience an increase in their sales and revenue. To meet a higher demand, business may need to increase their production and hire additional workers. The increase in employment and wages contribute to an increase in national income. The individuals who receive higher incomes are likely to spend a portion of its goods on goods and services. This additional consumer spending creates a new round of demand for business, further increase their sales and revenue. The cycle continues as the additional spending by consumers lead to more income for business and individuals. So why Keynesian school followers believe in multiplier effect? Here are the reasons. The first one, underutilized resource. They recognize that economy can operate without using all resources, such as unemployed labor and unused production capacity. In such situation, an increase in aggregate demand can stimulate economic activity and lead to the use of this underutilized resource. The second one, marginal propensity to consume. Keynesian economics emphasize the concept of MPC. They argue that during times of economic downturn or high unemployment, individuals have a higher MPC, meaning that they are more likely to spend a large fraction of their income. The third one, role of government intervention. They emphasize that the multiplier effect is more prominent when an economy operates without using all resources. They believe that in such situations, government spending can play a crucial role in stimulating economic activity and addressing unemployment. In the table, we can see a difference between classical school and Keynesian school. So let's talk it one by one. The first one is based on time horizon. The classical school focuses on long-run equilibrium, assume flexible prices and wages, and emphasize the self-regulating nature of markets. On the other hand, the Canadian school placed greater emphasis on the short run, recognized sticky prices and wages, and advocated for active government intervention to manage aggregate demand and address short-run economic fluctuation. And the second one is based on focus of analysis. Classical school is economic growth. They focus on factors such as capital accumulation and the efficient allocation of resources to drive sustainable economic growth over time. They believe that free markets, minimal government intervention, and the pursuit of individual self-interest lead to optimal long-term growth outcomes. The third one is based on concentration on GDP. The classical school focused on the general trend of GDP and long-term economic growth. It emphasized the factors that determine the potential output and growth rate of an economy over an extended period. And for the Canadian school, it's business cycle fluctuation. They focus on understanding and managing short-term fluctuation in economic activity, often referred to as the business cycle. It places a significant emphasis on the short-run dynamics of output, employment, and inflation. The third one is based on concentration on GDP. The classical school focused on the general trend of GDP and long-term economic growth. It emphasized the factors that determine the potential output and growth rate of an economy over an extended period. And for the Canadian school, they place a significant emphasis on the fluctuation of GDP and short-term economic dynamics, which refers to the periodic fluctuation in economic activity, including recessions, booms, and economic downturns. Next one is based on the emphasis side of economy. For the classical school, they emphasize on the supply side. They focus on the factors that influence long-term economic growth and the productivity capacity of an economy. And for the Canadian school, they emphasize on the demand side. They focus on the role of aggregate demand in influencing short-term economic fluctuation and employment level. The last one is based on the slope of aggregate supply. The classical school posed a vertical aggregate supply curve in the long run. According to the classical perspective, change in the aggregate demand, including change in the money supply, do not have a long-term impact on the economic output or employment level. But for the Canadian school, they assume that the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping in the short run. They suggest that the change in aggregate demand can lead to change in both output and price. Canadians argue that in the short run, prices and wages are sticky or inflexible, make it difficult for them to adjust quickly to change in market conditions. As a result, change in aggregate demand can have a direct impact on output and employment level. So if you have to choose to be a classical school follower or a Canadian school follower, which one are you going to be? For me, I prefer to be a follower of Canadian school because among the numerous pros and cons of Canadian economic, one of the most important benefits is the higher employment levels supported by the economic model. And also, I believe that sticky wages and prices may be exceed in the short run. That's all the news for this session. As this is the last session for today's news, we are going to get back to the main studio.
And that concludes our special breaking news edition of the Macroeconomic Report. We've covered a whirlwind of developments that have left an indelible mark on the global economy. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate your trust in our program as your go-to source for macroeconomic news. Until next time, I'm Benjamin, reminding you to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay ahead. Goodbye and take care. See you tomorrow at the same time in the same program.